Welcome and thank you for attending this session of the CBOR 2020 Con-Ed Conference. Today we'll be discussing the environmental considerations in repurposing real estate transactions. I'm Tom Wackerman and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. Unfortunately, I'm not live, so we won't be able to do any chat or any questions, but I will provide you in a minute with my contact information. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments. I would ask that you reference the CBOR 2020 session so that I know who you are. And then I'll be able to get back with you. And email is probably the best way to get a hold of me. A little bit of my background: I've been in the business of environmental consulting and real estate incentives for 47 years. I've also done a little bit of real estate development as a member of the Bell Tower LLC, which was a conversion of a church to condos. Been past chair of the University of Michigan Urban Land Institute Real Estate Forum, and currently I'm a member of the Urban Land Institute Urban Redevelopment Product Council. About 80% of my practice is representing developers and businesses, and the balance is representing municipalities. So I get to see really both sides of the equation when it comes to both environmental due diligence or environmental investigations, and when it comes to closing financing gaps and making deals work a little bit better in commercial conversions, in industrial conversions, in urban redevelopment, in areas like that. Quick background on ASTI Environmental. We were established in 1985. We have over 85% repeat referral. We've done 15,000 projects in the United States. We've done work in Canada, Mexico, Czech Republic, almost every county in Michigan. Have a broad background. And so I'm going to bring some of that perspective here today. We're going to cover 5 main topics. We're going to start with a background in environmental considerations and talk about some of the basics. We're going to do that so everybody's on the same page. Everybody has the same understanding of the terms that I'm using. We're then going to spend a little bit of time talking about what has happened with the regulations, and not so much the regulations in Michigan as the guidance and the policies. Those are what's really driving changes to both environmental due diligence and obligations for property owners in Michigan. There's certainly a new standard out there. I want to talk a little bit about that for phase 1s. And then I want to focus on the all-important vapor mitigation. It's becoming the driving factor in a lot of real estate deals, especially in Michigan. We'll then turn to some specific items concerning repurposing property, specifically, of course, commercial property, and some of the issues that we've seen. We'll talk a little bit about using incentives to offset extraordinary costs of this process. There's a lot more to it than we're going to go into, but it'll give you an idea of some of the ways that you can make a project work, especially when there are some major extraordinary costs. And then we'll spend a couple of minutes looking at an example project to understand a little bit about how this process lays out. And hopefully that'll bring these concepts all together and we'll be able to kind of visualize what it is I'm talking about and some of the pitfalls and how to get around those pitfalls. You know, in addition to what everybody understands as the statutory liability protection that it provides, real estate developers, property managers, brokers really need 2 additional major outcomes from any environmental due diligence. They need, number 1, to determine hidden environmental costs for purchase or operation. And they need, number 2, to identify what their due care obligations may be once they buy the property and start using it. A couple of key terms, because I've already used some and thrown them out. The first one is, what's a phase 1? It's called a phase 1 environmental site assessment, sometimes called a phase 1 ESA. And this is generally a review of publicly available information. It doesn't include any sampling or sample collection, although it can include a review of previous sampling programs. It's conducted according to the American Society of Testing and Materials, ASTM guidelines. And it's designed to provide you with statutory protection either as a bona fide purchaser, which is someone who's buying a contaminated piece of property, or an innocent landowner, which is someone who's buying a clean piece of property. The key takeaway for today is that a phase 1, the report that comes out, must be completed prior to purchase or occupancy of property. There's no exceptions for that. The second term we're going to be talking about is baseline environmental assessment, or the BEA. Now, this is only in Michigan and becomes a summary of the site conditions, the property conditions, as identified by any soil or groundwater or air or subslab sampling, any sampling that you do. And this document provides you with state statutory liability protection. As I said, it's only in Michigan and it's filed with Eagle. Phase 1 is not filed, you keep it, but the BEA is filed. And a BEA must be substantively completed within 45 days. That generally means the sampling has to be done, and then it has to be filed within 6 months of purchase. The third term is facility. A facility is any property where one or more compounds of hazardous substances, and there's a limited list of what that is, exceed what's called the generic residential cleanup criteria, sometimes referred to as GRCC. That's the published criteria for unrestricted use of a property as residential. And if you have a facility, you must file a BEA. Now, that doesn't mean you can't build on it. That doesn't mean you can't use it for residential. That doesn't mean that it is something that to walk away from. This is a statutory definition which determines what properties, for example, are brownfields. It determines what properties, for example, need a BEA. It determines what properties may need some kind of remedy, a cleanup, a control, or something like that. And the final term is due care obligations. Now, these are 6 specific items that we'll get into later that have to be completed when you buy a facility and operate a facility. And these are necessary to allow for the intended use. So they're based on, is it going to be industrial, is it going to be residential, of a property in a manner that protects public health and safety. Now, many of these terms, the phase 1 is a federal term, but many of these other terms, the BEA, facility, and to some extent due care obligations, all come from what's called Part 201 of Michigan Act 451. You may hear that sometimes. Let's also kind of frame the universe and keep the end in mind. There are 2 types of uses for closure. There's residential and there's non-residential. The old commercial, that used to be, I think, 4 or 6 different subcategories, and industrial are gone. There's only residential and non-residential. But there are 2 types of each. One is called unrestricted and one is called restricted. The unrestricted one is property that meets these generic criteria. So if you meet the generic residential cleanup criteria, you don't have to do anything. The property is considered clean, it's unrestricted, there's nothing that has to be done for residential use. And if you meet the non-residential or generic non-residential cleanup criteria, GNRCC, again, there's nothing that needs to be done on the property for non-residential use. Now, if you changed the use in the future, you may have an issue because you could have impacts between residential and non-residential. But the idea is that for non-residential use, it's unrestricted. There's nothing else you need to do. The other category is the restricted category. And that's where you would use engineered controls, administrative controls, institutional controls. You may do remediation like soil removal, but something is going to be done on the property that restricts in some way the use of the property, but you can still use it for residential. So for example, providing an isolation barrier so that the people who use the property aren't exposed to any of the compounds on the property. Now, this is an important distinction, both the residential and non-residential, and the unrestricted and the restricted. And it's important because what we're talking about today is repurposing property. And if you're going to take a property that was commercial, which is the non-residential category, and you're going to turn it in any way into residential, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute here, you need to meet either the unrestricted or restricted residential standard. And it might be that this property was fine for commercial, for the non-residential, but now additional engineered, administrative, or institutional controls, additional remedies may have to be implemented in order to move the property from non-residential to residential. There's a number of things that are going on in the environmental business having to do with tightening controls. And one of them is that the standards for phase one and some of the standards for phase two changed back in 2013. So the other thing to consider if you're repurposing a property is when was the last time it was looked at? It was looked at back in 2004 or 2003. There may be additional obligations, additional issues other than this non-residential to residential move that may come up. There's also a couple of different exposure considerations that need to be included. They have residential and non-residential implications. They're called pathways, and they generally fall into soils and groundwater. Those are the things that we're particularly concerned about. But depending on which of these pathways are applicable to your property, you may have different obligations, you may have different procedures. And the two that I'm going to be talking about shortly are the ones that are in bold on there. The first one, soil volatilization and air inhalation criteria, and the second one, groundwater volatilization and indoor air inhalation criteria. These are two standards, these are two exposure considerations which go to the concept of vapor intrusion, a concept we're going to be talking about, and where most of the change in terms of how you comply with the environmental requirements and due care requirements, most of the change has been occurring in those. So let's talk about the basic approach. So this is the basic buyer's approach for environmental due diligence. We call it the environmental due diligence process. You'll notice some things are in bold. Those are things that are particularly important. Some things have stars. Those are the basic liability protection documents from Michigan. There's 3 of them. Some things are in gray. Those things that don't always occur. Sometimes they occur, but not always. And then there's a whole bunch of other things in white. Due diligence is, of course, done to establish liability protection, as I mentioned before, but also the function has to be to identify impediments to development so that you can address them, either by remedy or through some sort of due care obligation. If your due diligence is not providing sufficient information to understand your obligations on the property, you're not going far enough. This process of obtaining both information and statutory protection has been part of the real estate process since about 1985. When people look at when you should have done due diligence, what was important for due diligence, they generally go back to 1985 and say, if you bought it before 85, you probably didn't have all these procedures. Did it after 1985, you did. And while those fundamental processes remain the same, in other words, doing a phase one, doing some sampling, trying to figure out what you have and what you're buying, the fundamental process is the same. They have changed in both how the assessment is done. There's a new standard that just came out in 21, for example, that we'll talk about shortly, and in what you have to do to achieve completion or closure. And all these things now affect real estate timing, the approval process, the construction sequencing, the cost of doing this. Past programs prior to about 2013 focused on determining the nature of historic impacts, but now new programs are focusing more on this due care obligations concept that I introduced earlier. Due care obligations that control impacts that may affect human health and the environment. Because of that, assessments now require more data and, in many circumstances, require agency review. So the key documents in Michigan are the Phase 1 ESA, as I said, that provides statutory protection on the federal level, the baseline environmental assessment in the middle there, which provides statutory protection on the state level, and also gives you a roadmap of what's going on in your property. But the third one, and now the more important one in terms of how things are focusing, is your due care plan. This defines what it is that you're going to do on your property day to day to protect human health, also called the DDCC documentation of due care compliance. This document is key. It's not filed with anybody, unlike the DEA, and it can cover a whole bunch of different things depending on the property and what you're going to be doing on the property. In all cases, a phase one needs to be done. I would strongly recommend that any purchase other than a single family owner occupied residential does a phase one. It's cheap insurance. It gives you some background. It's a good screening tool. The BEA we talked about, those are on facilities only and only in the state of Michigan. And then we just talked about the due care plan. Let's look at the different types of properties. For greenfields, which is not really the subject of this presentation, it's much simpler. You do a phase one, there's probably some ecological assessment, wetlands, threatened and endangered species, habitat, something like that. A lot of communities have tree ordinances, but the process is fairly straightforward. When the phase one is done, nothing comes up that's of a concern, and consequently, you're done with the process. Now, those concerns are called recognized environmental conditions in phase one. That's the term of art. And on a greenfield site, yeah, it usually plays out. However, don't assume for a minute that all greenfield sites are simply phase one and done. Use of sites as orchards, underground storage tanks or fueling operations, overuse of pesticides. I mean, these things can crop up in a phase one on a greenfield site, but the process generally is much simpler. In urban properties, it begins to get a little bit more complicated. There's a higher probability that the property is going to be impacted from historic use, and therefore a facility as we've defined it, and additional steps are probably required. The extent of these steps will depend on the chemicals that are identified, the pathways that are exceeded. We talked a little bit about pathways, and most importantly, the intended future use. And I'm guessing that for most repurposing of commercial, it's going to be repurposed to residential, and that is the most sensitive intended future use. And so consequently, there's a lot more documents. There may be a remediation options analysis there on the left. You may have to look at hazardous materials in a building or geotechnical issues for a new building because of fill material. You may have some remediation, closure, and restoration, or you may be putting in some kind of a remedy that requires operation and maintenance. So we just get a little bit more complicated, especially on urban sites. Now, there's a subcategory of this for acquisition of an existing business, typically an industrial business. In this case, there may be additional compliance assessments, there may be additional operating permits, plans, programs, things like that. So it adds another level of complexity to the process. And then by far the most complicated kind of subcategory is when you have to have agency approval. This is becoming more common, believe it or not, which is part of the challenge now in repurposing commercial properties. And in this case, you pretty much hit every box. There's all kinds of things that need to be done. And I'm going to show you what ends up in some cases being an infinite loop on these programs. But you need a lot more assessment. You need a lot more discussion. You need a lot more proving out what your assumptions are on the property. Now, there are some other boxes on here that we haven't talked about. There is, for example, screening tools. There are screening tools up there in the upper left-hand corner, which are very useful in identifying big rocks, big issues on a property, or more likely, they're very useful in identifying and comparing multiple properties. They're quick, they're inexpensive. You can look at 10 or 12 properties and say, well, this one's got a lot of hair on it. I'm not interested in it, so let's winnow it down to a couple and then spend some real money. But in creating successful real estate deals, there are also some other considerations. And on the right-hand side there, we have a couple of them. One of them being negotiating an exit strategy with a reluctant seller. This has come up time and time again, where you have somebody who owns a piece of property and they know that it's contaminated. They don't want to be sucked into a whole bunch of what are called affirmative obligations under the Act. And so they've just held on to it. They really don't want to do anything with it. Well, there might be an exit strategy. There might be something that protects both the buyer and the seller. There might be something that can be put together to make that seller much more comfortable with the transaction. And then, of course, underneath that, there's the whole idea of incentives. How do you, in some way, offset these costs? How do you, in the whole concept originally was leveling the playing field, right? The incentives were provided so that building on an urban site which has all kinds of additional extraordinary costs, would be the same as or a little bit less expensive than building on a greenfield site. You would level the playing field and more people would build on urban sites. So these incentives are out there to help do that, to level the playing field, to assist in those costs. And they primarily focus on urban brownfield type sites. So they're very much part of the conversation. Let's go quickly through the process. So at the very top, you select the site, and you need to find out what the issues, what are the environmental issues, what are my options, how do I get approvals that I need. And you might be surprised that the very next step there is that we ask about funding options. And the reason is that in many ways dictates what your process is going to be, whether you're going to go the right side or the left side. The right side being much simpler, and we call it the voluntary action program, and the left side being more complicated, more detail oriented, and that's when agency, specifically EGLE approval, is needed. And when would it be needed? It's when you need what's called a documentation of due care compliance approved. We talked a little bit about that earlier. It's when you need a certificate of completion, or more likely when you need a no further action letter. In these cases, you will be required to go through the EGLE process on the left because you need them to sign off. Surprisingly, this can occur in situations, funding situations that you may not think of. For example, if you're using state incentives, if you're using, and that would be TIF capture, it would be a CMI grants. If you're using federal funding, HUD, SBA guaranteed loans, MISTA, you have affordable housing. I mean, anytime you have federal funding or state funding involved, you end up on the left-hand side. But you could also go there by choice. There's nothing wrong with going through and getting EGLE approval. It's a more difficult process, it's a more timely process, and it's a more costly process, but you can voluntarily select to use it. In both cases, the basic due diligence process has changed slightly, but the EGLE due care process has changed significantly, and we'll see that in the next slide. It now requires more evaluation, it requires more reporting. In properties that exceed the vapor screening criteria, a year or more of sampling may be required. And if you have acute compounds, it may require even more sampling. And then a year of post-construction monitoring will be required. So it becomes much more intensive, especially in this category I talked about before, vapor intrusion. To compound this challenge, EGLE has institutionalized additional practices. And these practices change over the course of a given project as new technical data is reviewed by EGLE, as new concepts are incorporated into the review process. For example, now soil gas sampling in the upper 5 feet is not acceptable by EGLE. So characterizing actual soil concentrations in shallow soil is really not achievable, but without characterization, we can't get approval. So there are some technical issues that are being worked through, but they're being worked through as we bring projects through the system. That adds a whole level of challenge and complexity to this, in that you could get an agreement with EGLE and then that agreement changes because new technology comes in or new issues. You can see on the left-hand side, if you're doing federal funding and you want to go down the EGLE review process, the first thing is you have to stop, take a deep breath, and review additional requirements. You then conduct your phase 1 like you normally would. Are there any recognized environmental conditions? If there aren't, you're out of this. That's true on the right-hand side too. If it's a clean, quote unquote, phase 1, nothing else has to happen. However, if there's some indication from the phase 1 that there are recognized environmental conditions, then in both cases, you go into a limited phase 2. Limited phase 2 is where you only investigate those issues that came up in the phase 1. And in both cases, you ask the question, is it a facility? If it's a facility, you have to prepare a BEA regardless of which way you go. If it's not a facility, you're out again. It ends up ending the process. But where the real difference happens is when we go to the next slide. So in this process, the column A is the regulatory review column. And now you've got multiple possibly investigations into the nature and extent of the impact. You've got possibly multiple vapor assessments, depending on the results of the assessments. You prepare what's called a response activities plan, or we call it a RESAP for short. And you can see multiple places where EGLE is reviewing and commenting and asking for more data and going back and redoing things. At the end of the day, you end up in the same place in the lower right-hand corner, which is operate, maintain, and document your due care obligations. But in the process of B, the voluntary action program, you prepare your due care plan, and then you install the controls, or you remediate, or you do whatever's necessary to meet your due care obligations. Now, I want to be clear that just because they're different processes, they don't end up in different places. It's not like if you're doing a voluntary action program, you can put in a Pinto, but because you're doing a agency review, you have to put in a Cadillac. Not at all. In fact, good science would dictate that regardless of which process you take, you end up putting in a remediation system or a mitigation system that solves the issue. And it should, all things being equal, be the same system regardless of which process you follow. So let's talk, now that we have that background stuff out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the regulatory update. So the process always starts with a phase one, as I said before. It sets the stage for subsequent assessments, for the extent of those assessments. If there's no recognized environmental conditions, you're out. But for every recognized environmental condition you list, you have to now live with it. It stays with you. You have to investigate it. You have to figure out whether it's a concern or not. It raises questions about what else might be going on the property. So choosing those RECs carefully is very important. With the addition of this vapor intrusion things that I'm talking about, which came in 2013, the evaluation of potential RECs, recognized environmental conditions, now extend beyond the subject property to within 1,700 feet of the property boundaries. We're now not just looking at the four corners of our property. We have to consider the effect of adjacent property uses, especially and pretty exclusively actually, where those uses contain chemicals of concern for vapor intrusion. Now, that has to be determined in the phase one through document review. It's not from actual sampling. And so it tends to be somewhat conservative. And whether you need to go to the next step, whether the next step needs to go to another step, will depend on the extent of contamination. It'll depend on the documentation of the contamination. It'll depend on lithology. It'll depend on other factors such as soil type that affect migration. But because we're now looking beyond the property, and because we're focusing on the vapor intrusion issues, you may find a different result in a phase one now than you did in 2013 or before. So as I stated previously, be careful about what data you're using to assess a site. There's a bright line in 2013 which changed the way properties are assessed, especially for vapor intrusion. There's a new standard, as I mentioned earlier. It's called the -21, E1527-21. This will be replacing the current standard, which is -13. And as you can guess, the last two digits indicate the year in which it was put together, right? I've been talking about changes in 2013. This particular standard was kind of adopted, then it wasn't. So it's not officially in force right now. Officially, you have to comply with the -13 standard, but most consultants have moved to the -21 standard, including ASTI, mostly because we had to get ready for it anyway. But interestingly enough, a lot of the new things under that standard were already being done, and they were being done because they're good science, they're good ways to look at it, and this new standard really just codified them. So let's look at a couple of those things. So first of all, the recognized environmental condition of REC that I've been talking about for a while has now been further defined. In addition to some changes in the wording, primarily taking the word likely out, right, and making it more definitive in items 1 and 2 on the slide. It also added an appendix to help everybody get focused and a flow chart. And so the idea was to be more intentional about these RECs. So now they include the presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum product in, on, or at the subject property due to release, the likely presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum product in, on, or at the subject property, again, due to a release, and then the presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum product in, on the property under conditions that pose a material threat. This definition and all of the other supporting materials for it, as I said, has already been pretty much in effect for most consultants, and therefore it isn't a big change, but it helps focus and it helps make it more intentional. There's now a requirement to use standard historical sources. There's been some controversy over using, for example, free historic databases, which don't tend to be nearly as robust as things like the Sanborn maps. And so prior to this particular change, the standard required that you used as many as you could find or as many as you deemed necessary, which could only mean a single source. Now, you've got to look at these three at least for both the subject property and adjacent property. And more importantly, if you can't review them, you have to say that. And in the past, you didn't have to say that. So again, it's becoming a little bit more intentional and a little bit more robust. It's added a non-scope consideration section. Now, those of you who are familiar with bank lending requirements know that often in the lender's documents, they'll have additional requirements for phase 1. Well, we call those non-scope requirements because the bank is requiring them, not the ASTM standard. They've taken a similar idea here and they said, look, there's a lot of discussion out there about other things that are going on, especially emerging contaminants of concern. And they're not specifically in the scope of the phase 1, but we really think they should be considered. So these are now called non-scope. And for example, the PFAS chemicals, which I'm sure you've heard of from newspaper and radio articles. These have not yet been listed in the federal regulated hazardous substances list, which is that list I said is very defined and defines the universe for this process. And therefore wouldn't normally be included in here, but they are now by reference included as non-scope. So those are the kind of the big changes. They sound a little bit technical, but I think the idea here is that we're getting more intentional, more focused, trying to bring in more consistency into the process. But the big change has been an emphasis on vapor mitigation. And I would say this, it literally sucks. And it literally sucks because frankly, the solution is literally a vacuum cleaner applied under a building. So at the end of the day, it sucks, right? Getting through this process is difficult, but not impossible, because it's a question of having sufficient data to prove your conceptual site model. And it's having sufficient data to prove that your design is going to be acceptable at the end of the day. So what's the basics? The basic concept is that contaminants, which we call chemicals of concern, in soils or groundwater can volatilize those white arrows coming up and migrate into a building, maybe through cracks, maybe through construction flaws, where they can accumulate. If that migration results in sufficiently high concentrations, indoor air may present a threat to the health and safety of the occupants and the public, and controls need to be used. Now, the list of compounds that could potentially migrate might surprise you, these chemicals of concern, and they vary by regulatory agency across the country. Every list includes what we call volatile organics. Some states like Michigan also include semi-volatile organics, semi-volatile compounds, and some inorganic compounds like mercury. Mercury has been a major problem we'll see or a major challenge we'll see in a second. The process is influenced by various factors. You can see wind on there, stack effect, temperature changes, pressure changes. All of these influence this process. But there's a in theory that all makes sense, but there's another complication to this. And maybe it's not just in theory it makes sense. I mean, here in Michigan, we've had a number of instances where houses have exploded because of methane accumulation in the basin from adjacent landfills. So it's probably more than theory, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on theory. So the first challenge is that these regulations and guidance documents are predictive. They don't measure actual harm. Sampling is used to predict concentrations and then to predict risk. And so depending on your model, depending on your site conditions, depending on how good your model is, you can end up with kind of different results. So what we typically do is we take a soil sample. That's always the first kind of idea on it. We then may take a soil gas sample underneath the slab in the building, and then we predict what's going to be the concentration in the building. Now, I'm being somewhat simplistic in it, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that: nature and extent, determination of physical conditions that may affect volatilization and vapor transport. But in the bottom line, that's what we're going to be doing: sampling the environment, predicting what could be in the building. And this is difficult because there's also common background sources. I mean, there's benzene, for example, from gasoline, cigarette smoke, scented candles, rugs, paint, glue. There's perchloroethylene from dry cleaners, adhesives, glues. There's tetrachloroethylene from adhesives, paint removers, spot removers. I mean, the indoor environment is a very complicated environment and has lots of different influences in it. And whether the chemicals of concern actually impact the building interior is dependent on a number of factors: the concentration, the chemical, the distance to the building construction, the building maintenance and conditions. And then whether those chemicals of concern are a threat depends on a number of factors: the toxicity of the chemical, the air exchange rate, occupancy durations, and ultimately the actual indoor air concentration of the building at the time. And these models can get quite complicated. For example, here's just some of the factors and assumptions used in these models: isolation distances, migration rates, fill material versus soil, occupancy duration. All of this is included. And the attempt, of course, is to take environmental data and understand its impact on the building. This model, called the Johnson-Ettinger model, has been modified with policies and procedures and interpretations by Eagle so that it has layer upon layer upon layer, and may seem overly complicated, maybe not very real world. But the idea is to address what happens between contamination at the bottom there in gray and the building envelope itself. This involves a series of generic property and building assumptions. Any deviation from these assumptions requires a site-specific determination. And frankly, most of the sites in Michigan require that kind of site-specific determination. That's because they have fill soils or shallow groundwater or some of the other criteria that don't let you use the generic approach, but require you to do site-specific. Evolving science keeps changing conceptual site models and data interpretation. For example, now fill material is being evaluated differently than soils. Fill material is in most urban areas. Therefore, you're going to have a conversation of fill material really pretty much anywhere in an urban area. The third challenge, the third issue, is that the presumptions in this model are that the contaminations move laterally in some predicted pattern. I won't go into this too detailed, but the point I want to make is that migration is measured from the edge of the impact, not from the source, which would be A in this picture, not from where the release occurred, which would be B in this picture, not from where the release maybe just vertically migrated to, which would be C in this picture, but what went on in the environment itself, which would be D and E. And then you have to look 100 feet for non-petroleum, 30 feet for petroleum to determine what the impact is. You got to look at different building types: basement, slab on grade, crawl space, multi-story, elevator shaft. So it does become quite complicated. Part of the complication then is collecting sufficient data to be able to determine what all these factors are doing, what's going on. The real world implication is that urban properties, for example, this one in Detroit in red, which don't have any specific environmental recs on them, now have adjacent environmental recs. In this case, there were 3 petroleum uses within 30 feet that prior to 2013 probably meant the phase one came out as clean, but now means the phase one comes out and says, hey, you've got to look at what the impact of these petroleum uses, the adjacent petroleum uses is. So the key red flags then become former industrial sites, dry cleaners, gas stations, oil heaters, oil repair shops, all of which have to be looked at not only on the subject property, but in terms of the adjacent property. The kicker is that once you start sampling, if you find something, you can't what we call data out, which means you can't then do more data and say, well, this data is better than that data. If you detect even a single exceedance, you probably are going to be putting in some kind of mitigation system because you're going to be assumed to have a vapor intrusion issue. And then equally important is how the standards are applied. I mentioned mercury before. The vapors, the volatilization to indoor air standard there, as you can see, is 22 on the right. That's higher than, that's lower than our ability to detect it, which is at 50, so it defaults to 50. But it's also lower than the statewide background for mercury in certain soils at 130. And so it sets up this problem where we might find naturally occurring mercury and still have an issue with it. Another example of that is urban settings where you have anthropomorphic contributions from just daily activities such as phenanthrenes and naphthalenes in that bottom table, and the background value exceeds what's acceptable for the criteria because nothing having to do with the property, but because it's urban and it's been used. And consequently, as we start collecting samples on properties, we end up with the possibility of finding issues. And then finally, in terms of all of these kind of issues for vapor intrusion, there's also some conflict in science and therefore the actual risk. For example, the Eagle recommended media-specific volatilization indoor interim action screening levels, RIAZL, that's a mouthful, for perchloroethylene is 41 micrograms per cubic meter. The OSHA standard for a worker to work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for 21 years or 20 years, whatever the active life of the worker is 678,000 micrograms per meter. And a study conducted by US EPA in a closet where they had put a man's suit, a woman's skirt, and 2 blouses, came up with actual concentrations of 200 micrograms per cubic meter. So the science is evolving. What is real risk? What are background contributions? What should somebody be exposed to? There's a camp that says nothing. There's a camp that says, along the lines of OSHA thinking, there's an acceptable exposure limit. Where is that limit? So the issue here is not just that we have vapor intrusion, vapor mitigation concerns now on properties, but the issue is that it is evolving science that you get involved with, and therefore it's not as easy or straightforward as some of the other issues. What are the solutions? Well, you have to go through the process. And the first step is you have to assess the impact of the soil and groundwater contamination. The next step is you have to conduct subslab, you have to conduct soil gas sampling, typically below a slab. That's that picture in the upper right-hand corner. Then you have to look at the subslab conditions for design. You have to, if you're getting EGLE approval, you have to go through review and approval by EGLE. You then have to design the system, install the system, shake down the system, and then operate it and maintain it in perpetuity. And this is for a potential vapor intrusion. A couple of different solutions. There's vapor barriers, there's passive soil gas systems, active soil gas systems. And the one that's becoming probably more pervasive, more used, is just soil removal. Dig and dump, get it out of there, get the source material out of there. It is expensive, but it removes the need for long-term operation and maintenance. So now that we've talked about some of the trends in the environmental side and how they're affecting real estate transactions in general, let's talk specifically about repurposing commercial properties. Let's start with a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that you're in a high risk or medium risk category. This doesn't apply to unimpacted sites, which only need a phase one. Therefore, they're in and out, as I mentioned before. But it applies to sites that are known to be contaminated, sites that are suspected of being contaminated, sites that historically have these red flag high risk uses I mentioned, soils that have fill material, sites that have fill material, especially if that non-soil material, if that fill material contains non-soil materials like brick and construction debris and wood, and anywhere that mercury is detected. Mercury is kind of a special category. A medium risk site is any property in an urban area, any property in an area that included these high risks, doesn't have to be on the subject property, and any place that has shallow groundwater. If your repurposed property sits in one of these two categories, you've got to be ready for a lot more assessment than was done in the past, and probably the installation of some sort of control or mitigation remedy. Before you repurpose, before you even think about it, you need to consider a couple of things. First of all, properties that have been previously used, especially in urban areas, and I don't mean just for industrial, I mean previously used, will most likely come with historic impacts. Some of those will be area-wide, a deposition from factories or incinerators or cars idling. You know, there's lots of things that happen in urban areas that created surface contamination on properties. Adjacent uses, people who in the 1920s and 1930s turned their garages into auto repair shops or gas stations. I mean, all kinds of different previous uses can result in historic impacts. Secondly, impacts can last a very long time. I get many clients who say, well, this hasn't been a gas station since 1920. How can that possibly be an issue? It could be an issue. Depends on the chemical, the concentration, the soil type, a whole bunch of other factors. And business operated very differently prior to the mid-'80s when all these regulations came out. And so dumping stuff in the back or creating a pit to filter your greases was all too common. And so older sites can still trigger all of these concerns, even if they're very old. And then finally, the use of adjacent properties up to 100 feet can trigger obligations on your property. And so check these things out. If these things exist, be ready for a more complicated process than would otherwise be obvious. Now, I've talked about facility-wide due care obligations. Now, assuming that your due diligence, that process of phase 1 DEA that I talked about for statutory protection, is conducted correctly, and therefore the owner of this property is an innocent landowner or bona fide purchaser, then these are their obligations. Otherwise, if they haven't done that process right, they get sucked into strict liability, joint and several, retroactive liability. There are other legal defenses. That's not the point of this conversation. The point is, if you do the process right, these are the 6 things that you have to do. And I've highlighted in black the key ones. You have to prevent exacerbation, you have to mitigate unacceptable exposure, and you have to take precautions against unforeseeable acts or omissions of a third party. So if you're going to be repositioning property and there's a possibility it's going to be contaminated, as I said in the previous slide, get ready to do these things. There's a high probability you're going to have to. So what are the specific considerations in repurposing? First of all, each new purchaser will have to have their own due diligence. You can't rely on the previous purchaser. You can't rely on your partner's documentation. Now, reliances can be provided, reliance letters, but they're only as good as the date of the report. But each new purchaser needs a phase 1. I've already mentioned about previous phase 1s. Don't assume they're representative. They were done differently if they were done prior to 2013. And probably the most important one is even partial conversions to residential requires a residential closure. Whether it's restricted or non-restricted is up to you, but they require a residential closure. So if you're going from commercial to better commercial, that's still non-residential. If you're going from commercial to industrial, that's still non-residential. But if you're going from commercial to mixed use or multifamily residential or single family residential or affordable housing, any of those residential categories, you're going to have to meet a residential standard, which may mean a very different approach to the property than it was previously used for, or that it was previously evaluated for. And it may mean all kinds of additional requirements for controls if you wanted to have a restricted closure. Assuming you're going to retrofit an existing building, there are other considerations. So in addition to the phase one process, in addition to the question of residential or non-residential closure, when reusing existing building, you better be ready to understand the asbestos assessment and abatement requirements, or if you're going to keep asbestos in place, the management requirements. But if you're going to do demo and renovation, you have to do assessment and abatement. The lead paint requirements for residential, specifically difficult for affordable, which is now called attainable, by the way, housing, but lead-based paint requirements, universal waste removal, mercury switches, things like that. Maintenance or replacement of hard surface cover. You've already got a parking lot. You can't just take the parking lot out. If you already have a building pad, you can't just take the building pad out because they're acting as engineered controls. They may need to remain in place in order not to exacerbate the existing conditions. You may have to retrofit for a vapor mitigation system if you have a vapor problem. You're certainly going to have to comply with any land use or deed restrictions that apply to the existing buildings. And you may have to install additional engineered controls because you're changing the use or you're changing the design. Even if you're going to demolish the building, there are additional considerations. Obviously, pre-demolition asbestos assessment and abatement, universal waste removal prior to demolition. Again, maintenance of hard surface. Again, maybe a new vapor system. Again, land use and deed restrictions. Again, maybe additional engineered controls. But now let's add in, you may need a soil management disposal plan. If the property is a facility, you can't just take the soil off of it. You may need to seal storm and sanitary sewer lines that pass through impacted soils. You can't just lay the lines because then you have the possibility of contaminated groundwater leaking into those lines. Most developers fail to take into account these extraordinary costs. So it really needs consideration up front. It can't be something you suddenly discover later on. Now, we've already talked about your capital stack and how it sometimes may suck you into needing additional requirements because you need EGLE approval, but recognize that your capital stack doesn't affect the type or extent of due care requirements that you have. My conclusion on this is that residential closure is challenging. You have to choose between unrestricted and restricted and all of the implications of that. You may have notification requirements for residents. You certainly have to understand the actual site conditions and address any change in use from non-residential to residential. Urban properties are even more challenging, right? Because you have fill material, there are background impacts. Closure may actually be elusive because of these impacts. And then getting EGLE approval is the most challenging. Vapor systems may require 1 to 2 years before EGLE approval. So the biggest issue for us is urban residential redevelopment from a previous use that requires EGLE approval. That is a time-consuming and costly process. And be ready to do it. It doesn't mean it isn't worth it. It doesn't mean that you can't accomplish it, but it certainly is a different thought process, time schedule, and cost than looking at just a regular site. A couple of quick things on incentives. They're available. There's 5 eligibility requirements. There's 4 what we call threshold requirements. It really requires a great project. There's a couple of ways to look at it. Is it in a target area? Is it a clear economic benefit? Is it transformational? Is there a financial need? Are there extraordinary costs? But in some cases, if you can't get through those, incentives may not be available. But if they're available, they're really a good option. There's different incentives, tax abatements, TIF. There's a list of some of the ones in Michigan that are available. And they play out in various ways. I don't really have time to go over this now in this particular presentation, but be happy to have you sit in on one of my presentations, in-depth presentations on incentives for real estate development. Let's quickly, in our last 5 or 10 minutes, take a look at an example project. So this is going to be somewhere in Metro Detroit, somewhere in downtown Detroit, a typical Detroit project, a building that's been sat vacant for quite a while. It consists of an old parking deck in the back, some infill retail along the main street there, 2 former residences that have been converted to commercial. So this block, this area, the yellow, which is the project boundaries, is really a commercial development that they want to change into a mixed-use development. So still maintain some commercial along the main drag there in the front, do some residential and commercial along the side street, rebuild the parking deck. It's a combination of new construction and existing reuse. So it's a real meaty project. It's got all of the components that I've talked about. It's about an $18 million project. It's going to use multiple sources of funding, including state funding. And so now we've got Eagle involved because of the state funding issue. It's going to be about 23,000 square feet of residential, 11 of commercial, 67,000 square feet of both parking and event space. And when we take everything into account, including all of the incentives, it's got an IRR of about 7.5. Now that's important because that's a threshold, one of the key threshold criteria for most of these programs. Now, the problem is that we've got contamination. All the buildings have asbestos, of course, why not? There's an underground storage tank out front, of course, why not? But we also have contaminated soils in 3 different flavors. We've got contaminated soils that are just contaminated and they have stuff in them. We've got soils that exceed the non-residential criteria, and that's that brown area called contaminated soils. And then we have soils that exceed the hazardous waste criteria, so really contaminated soils. And we have to look at 100 feet around them because that indicates that we have a potential vapor intrusion issue. So it's got a lot of hair on it. And these costs, these extraordinary costs, run about $827,000 with an additional $584,000 for soil remediation in a least contaminated area. Well, that's a pretty substantial ticket, and it indicates that incentives are definitely needed. But the funny thing is that most developers won't even think of those costs when they go into it. It's not part of the pro forma. I would suggest to you that in any of the high risk or medium sites that I talked about, if you're converting commercial to residential, you need to think about those things right up front. So we've got about 5.8 million here in what are called eligible expenses. You notice that some of those costs, like parking deck construction there in the list and building demo, are normally conducted on a real estate deal anyway. So those are real incentives, the other ones being extraordinary costs. And so what we're going to be doing, we're doing excavation, we're going to be doing removal, we're going to be doing abatement, we're going to be putting in a vapor mitigation system. We got a number of different incentives for this particular client. You can see in box number 1, some of those were brownfield TIF, about 4.6 million, 26-year payback on that. We were able to get an Eagle grant for an additional 550,000. We were able to get a tax abatement under the OPRA program, the Obsolete Property Rehabilitation Act, for about 833, and a Michigan Strategic Fund loan for about 2.2. So the incentives package ended up being 8.2 million. Pretty substantial incentives package, but then again, a pretty substantial need on this property. Of that, about 11%, about 878,000, are what I would call offsetting benefits. Those are the things that cover extraordinary costs, things that most people won't even think of. And about 89% of it is what I'll call true benefits in box number 2 there. And those are getting assistance on things that you would have had to do anyway, but are just too complicated to really make the site work. We also had the ability to look at the MSF funding. We were able to use a basis of about 11 million in total costs. We were able to get 20% of that. That's where we got the 2.3 number. But the point of this slide is to look over at the bottom number. We requested 10 million. We ended up with 8. And that happens for a number of reasons, including the fact that it's financially driven. If your IRR is too high, some of those asks will be shaved a little bit in order to make it a little bit more user-friendly in terms of the community. Now, I was going to go through a couple of things on the taxes, but let me just quickly say that this is the base tax for it. This is the unabated tax for it. This is how the OPRA abatement played out. Now, the OPRA abatement didn't apply to the whole project because some of it's new construction, so it only applied to 60%. And this is how the brownfield TIF played out. The bottom line in all this is that at the end of the day, the project incentives included not only benefits for the developer, 4.6 million in eligible expenses, 833,000 in the tax abatement, 2.8 million for public infrastructure that they're constructing on their property, but also for the local unit of government, the LUG. They get access to the public infrastructure. They get over $1 million in administrative costs. They get over 1.1 million in local revolving fund costs. They also get an increase in local taxes, total tax increase about 2.4 million. And there's something in this for the state, increased taxes and the state revolving fund. So these are truly public-private partnerships. And the idea is that they benefit by cleaning up a site, by taking a site that was undevelopable and turning it into a project. But this particular project includes all of those issues that we saw in the repurposing of a commercial project. So in summary, meeting due diligence obligations are certainly the responsibility of every property owner, and preventing adverse impacts to human health is a key component of that responsibility. No question about that. In cases where there's a documented risk, implementing the proper controls or conducting remediation are essential. They're essential for safe use of the property. They're essential under the Act. However, where risks are estimated or assumed or implied or maybe, then implementing those controls can be difficult because the definition of acceptable performance can keep changing based on new data, new research, new approaches. And that's kind of where we are on some of these. We have to be ready to deal with that. And because of that uncertainty, both of the assessment and EGLE's review and approval, all projects that require EGLE approval require a response activity plan, a documentation of due care compliance, a certificate of completion, a no further action letter, state incentives, federal funding. All of those will need to schedule at least a year of assessment and review before approval. It's just part of the process now. And then compliance with screening criteria is much more difficult for residential than for non-residential. So choosing a new use as residential, primarily because of the lower cleanup levels, means that the residential project will require more time for assessment and more robust mitigation systems and more cost for assessment. That's just the given in today's market. So any repurposing of residential requires residential closure, restricted or unrestricted. For facilities, new care obligations will apply. When you're using federal funds, EGLE review and approval will apply. EGLE review and approval adds cost and time. EGLE's view of evolving science and options changes conceptual site models, changes in interpretation, changes design, and you have to be ready for those changes. And consequently, traditional real estate timelines, traditional due diligence timelines are now insufficient for the EGLE approval process. Keep that in mind. So thank you very much. I'd like to take questions, but I'm not here, as you know. I'm actually somewhere else because this is a taped presentation. But thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it. I hope you learned something. Have a good day.